Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Next week, the Treasury is going to publish analysis of what the immediate impact will be. And one consequence of leaving the European Union is that there will be a hit to the value of people's homes of at least 10% and up to 18%. At the same time, mortgages will get more expensive and mortgage rates will go up. Now, some people say that's a price worth paying. I say we are stronger and better off inside the European Union.
What do you make of that intervention, Nick, and the maths involved?
Well, let's look at the small print and then the big print. The big print is that George Osborne wants to think that our properties, if we leave the European Union, would fall between 10 and 18% in the first 2 years after an exit. But let's look at the small print. George Osborne chose his words carefully. He didn't say property values would fall. He said they would be hit, because actually what those figures mean is that they would fall between 0.6% and 8.6%, because what they're saying is the Office for Budget Responsibility says that properties are due to rise by 9.4% in those 2 years. What they're saying is they'd fall between 10 and 18% off that 9.4%.
So it's about not going up. That's rather right. Than definitely falling.
Yeah.
We also heard from the Leave side, Michael Gove in particular, making claims about the number of people that would enter the UK and about the unsustainability of the NHS that would result in. Let's just have a listen to him.
The idea of asking the NHS to look after a new group of patients equivalent in size to 4 Birminghams is clearly unsustainable. Free movement on that scale will have huge consequences for the NHS. There will be a rise in accident and emergency attendances of between 6 and 13 million visits per year, an enormous additional demand on a system already under pressure.
What do you make of that, Nick?
Well, again, let's look at the big print and the small print. The big print is that the Leave side think that immigration is one of their big trump cards because of the large rise in immigration when the EU expanded to the east in 2004 and 2007. And what they're saying is if 4 Western Balkan countries and Turkey join, they say that immigration from those countries by 2030 would be between 2.7 and 5 million. Let's look at the small print. They are making some massive assumptions. Assumption number 1 is that those 5 countries will all join in 2020. Highly unlikely. EU very keen to get former Yugoslav republics in because it helps stabilise that former war zone. Very unkeen on getting Turkey in. Assumption number 2 is you reach the 5 million figure by saying you do not impose the so-called transitional controls. That's to limit immigration to those countries for 7 years. The UK didn't do it for the 2004, but they did do it in 2007. If you have transitional controls, then it goes down to 2.7. Assumption number 3 is that Turkey will join in 2020. It is highly, highly unlikely that Turkey will join. In France, there would have to be a referendum for Turkey to join. There is only one country that's really keen about Turkey joining. That's the United Kingdom. And now that the UK government's having to consult voters, they're becoming a little less keen.
There are a lot of ifs in all this. Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's unpack that a little bit further with John Mills. He's the chair of Labour Leave, also a businessman, and has chaired many housing committees too. So, John Mills, I'm going to start, if you don't mind, by looking at this idea that George Osborne raises, that a Brexit will massively affect the price of our homes. Do you buy that?
I think it's pretty unlikely. And to be honest with you, I think of all the various threats there are to the British economy, Brexit is relatively a small one, if you think it's a threat at all, compared to what's happening in China, what's happening in Greece, what's happening potentially in Italy.
But you'd accept short-term there could be profound economic shocks, that's his phrase, and a profound economic shock could certainly hit the housing market.
Well, I'm not so sure I'd buy the idea there's going to be a profound economic shock. I don't really see why there should be. I think life will continue much as it was before. After Brexit, there will be some transitional changes.
No change in house prices?
I think they'll probably go on creeping up, if anything, because of demand exceeding supply. But I think the chance that there's going to be an enormous reduction, but even if there was, I'm not so sure that would be such a bad thing anyway, because I think prices are very high in the housing market.
Let me ask you whether, honestly, hand on heart, you would tear apart some of the wider claims on your own side too. We've heard Michael Gove suggest that net immigration could swell to another 5 million if we stay, putting the NHS under severe pressure. Do you buy that figure?
Well, I think that figure does depend on a lot of ifs, as you heard just now. I do think it's quite likely that immigration will go up, though. If
By
we have
5 million?
No, I think probably with a lower figure than that, but still quite a lot. If we've got a living wage of £9 an hour, which is more than twice what people are earning in Romania.
So as a Labour figure, would you say that price is too high, that £9?
No, I think there's a lot to be said for having a living wage, but I think it will also attract people in from the continent, particularly if there are very high levels of unemployment continuing.
And he used this very strong phrase, it would put the NHS under unsustainable pressure. Sounds like it would spell the end of the NHS if we stayed in. Do you believe that?
No, I'm not sure that it would make the NHS collapse, but I do think there is a big problem, which is that we don't spend nearly enough in relation to our rising population on new hospitals, on new schools, on new roads, and that's why there is a bit of a crisis in all these areas.
In a former life, pre an EU ref, you would sit presumably on a very different side to Michael Gove. Is your version of out, do you think, the same as Michael Gove? You're a businessman, you understand that the idea of us being on the outside of the single market, you'd say that's the right way to go?
Well, I'm not sure we would be on the outside of the single market, although we may be. No, I think there is something to be said for doing that, because if we're going to control our borders, we have to be outside the single market. But that wouldn't stop us selling to the European Union. You don't have to be in the single market to sell that.
But he's, you know, the phrase he used, or the example he picked, was Albania. We'd be another Albania. Does that appeal to you in the same way that it appeals to him?
Well, I think Canada's probably a better comparator, and there's a new trade treaty coming in with Canada, which I think...
7 years in the making, wasn't it?
Well, it did take quite a long time in the making, but we're there, and that's coming into force, and that seems to be a rather better bet, a rather more attractive prospect, perhaps, than just dealing with Albania.
I wonder if you feel happy, though, with the way the Vote Leave campaign is being run. I mean, you don't actually agree with that figure of 5 million new immigrants. You clearly don't agree that the NHS would collapse under this sort of pressure. Do you think this is helping your side to hear those sorts of claims and figures being thrown around?
Well, I think there's been a fair bit of hyperbole, to be honest with you, on both sides, and I don't think this really helps very much, to be honest with you. I think you're much better to stick to figures that people find credible. There's plenty of data around which is very important in this debate, and I don't think you need to gild the lily to make the points that people are making.
Is anything sacred in this debate? Here's Polly Mackenzie, former advisor to Nick Clegg, and Peter Oborne, political columnist for the Daily Mail. Very nice to see you both here. I wonder, Peter, if you look at the polls and the poll of polls that seem now to put Remain with this 10-point lead, whether you think they have won the economic argument that was at the heart of all this, and they've done it.
I don't think that, no. I think they might have presented their argument better than the Leave side, but I certainly don't think they've won it. I wouldn't be in favour of leaving if I felt that the economic argument was right. But I do think you are right. There are divisions inside the Leave campaign. It hasn't been done very well, and they need to sort themselves out in the 3 or 4 or 5 weeks that are left.
So you think they can heal those divisions, and how would they do that?
I think that the Remain campaign has been very well run. It's got a consistent message, whereas the Leave campaign, there are two campaigns, as you know. You've got the sort of UKIP lot and the Tory lot, and
the Labour lot, as we've just
seen.
And
indeed, they're very distinct. Marvellous, John Mills, you've just been hearing from, and they are saying different things. But to me, it's pretty obvious that Britain would flourish outside the European Union.
Polly, when I introduced you, I was talking about the week starting with this idea of ISIS, you know, welcoming Brexit, and homeowners seeing their houses tumble, or their prices tumble by 18%. It's all rather apocalyptic on the Remain side, isn't it?
I think it's apocalyptic on both sides. You know, on the one hand, you've got terrifying predictions about the NHS, and people will be practically dying in the streets, according to the Vote Leave campaign. And on the other side, we'll all practically be homeless. Though actually, it's the first thing I've heard that might persuade me to vote Leave is the idea that house prices might drop and homes become more affordable.
Except that he goes on to say that mortgage rates will go up as well, and so it's a recession as opposed to a cheaper housing market. I don't know if that.
No, I'm still persuaded that we should vote in, but I'm not really looking to the politicians to provide me with facts about the future. It's not possible to know the future. In the end, it's about an assessment of risk and possibility.
So do you think we've just run this completely the wrong way round? I mean, you know, we keep on asking politicians, what does out look like? And of course, there are 6 different ways that out can look like. And you're saying from inside even, you don't think that politicians can provide you with those facts. So, I mean, was there another way of tailoring this debate away from preposterous argument, do you think?
Of course there was, and there are quite good fact-check outfits. Full Fact, actually, does a very good job, for instance. But
Full Fact doesn't stop people repeating the thing that they wanted to repeat in the first place.
I think that, curiously enough, that the Leave campaign have been much more responsible. They've made mistakes. But if you look at the inflammatory stuff from the Prime Minister, you know, he invokes the Amir of the Caliphate of IS, you know, that they want Baghdadi. I mean, this is bollocks. He's supporting the European Union. He's invoking World War III. He's taking lead of his senses. Whereas, and I think this is quite an important point, that when Mr. Johnson, Boris Johnson, made rather a learned observation about the
You're going to bring us into Hitler, presumably, now.
Yeah, he said to Philip II, Napoleon. You know, there have been these numerous attempts.
Look, they've both...
No, but then if you look at the response from Heseltine or Hilary Benn to these very sensible, unexceptional remarks by Boris Johnson, they're fanatical, they're weird. And it goes back to a technique that's been used I did a pamphlet called Guilty Men about the campaign to keep us in the euro. And the pro-euro mob, their central thesis were moderate, were sensible. And out there are these extremists who are swivel-eyed. And
I wonder if you think that's true, Polly. Do you think they have sort of played this, you know, being in is being very quiet and nice and respectable? Is that how it's been played?
I think what Peter's describing is just politics. You know, people do speak in exaggerated tones and they do make a case with these hyperbolic suggestions and implications about the future. And it has always been thus. If you look at the AV referendum, there were ridiculous claims that, you know, that babies would be dying if we voted for AV.
But do you quietly bite your fist when you hear David Cameron saying without the EU there would be war or ISIS want us to leave or any of those things, or do you say fair game?
It's what you expect, because they have to speak in simplistic tones, because the amount of time people are going to spend thinking about this in the end is quite limited, and they do look to their politicians to do a lot of the kind of macro and analytical thinking for them.
What was that great quote that students, you know, most students can't actually name the date of the EU referendum? Do you still think at the end of all this that politicians are talking to themselves in a tiny circle, or do you think it is reaching out?
I think it's an important debate, but I do reiterate that it is. I make this quite impartially. The Remain case, particularly the Prime Minister, is being extremely reckless, making absurd statements. Whereas I reckon the Leave lot are being much more responsible.
Well, you know, as you saw earlier...
What you're trying to do in this studio is that on the one hand there's this awful lot, on the other hand there's this awful lot. We at the BBC are fantastically moderate and impartial. It's absolute nonsense, and you are playing it up. The BBC is part of the problem. You are playing up the Hitler story about Boris, which is a constructed story.
What was the thing that you didn't like that I asked you about? Because actually we've been pretty fair.
No, I know what you're doing. What you're doing is creating a false dichotomy between one lot of people are telling lies and another lot of people are telling lies.
You said you're completely impartial.
Let's make a judgment about which ones are telling the worst lies. And the people telling the worst lies by far are David Cameron, George Osborne, who've hijacked the civil service to tell...
Polly, this is an impartial view from Peter Oborne. Would you like to respond?
No, I'm on the Leave side, but I just point out, let's not just pretend you're impartial, by the way.
The
BBC is part of the problem. You're the ones who inflamed the Hitler analogy. You turned that into a story. It wasn't a story at all.
So it's come back on us. Would you like to have a last word, Polly?
When people who are biased, like Peter or like me, listen to politicians, we naturally assume that the people we like are telling the truth and the people we don't like are not telling the truth. That's just, it's hardwired into our brains, and I think Peter has slightly lost touch with
So is it okay to say that
Baghdadi
supports the European Union and that ISIS are supporting the Remain campaign, and it's perfectly normal to say World War III will break up? Look, there is a sort of basic level of public debate which the Remain side, your lot, are failing or breaking down on.
At the risk of accusations of bias, we have run out of time. Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.
getting away with it all.